Good morning. A special shout out to all of you in the Pacific and the West. I wore this bright blouse, though the coloring here doesn't quite show how bright it is. Make sure everybody was awake. Thanks for being with us today. We do have closed captioning available. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see an option that says closed caption. And if you click on that, there's an option to show subtitles. So for anybody who would like that available, it is available for webinars. I'm Denise Pekka, and want to welcome you to the 2021 CityMatCH Leadership and MCH Epidemiology Conference. We made it. It's been another wild ride of a year, huh? We want to thank all of you. We know how hard the past couple years have been. I want to thank all the CityMatCH staff, and you will get to see them all over the next few days. We're running all the sessions. The Conference Planning Committee and our conference partners, CDC, DRH, and HRSA's MCH Epi. We had hoped to be in person, and we are planning we were busy planning a hybrid conference, and then came late summer, and then the decision to go entirely virtual. We have planned a conference with content we're really excited about, one that acknowledges the impact of the past 2 years and inspires and encourages. Thanks to all of you who are sharing this meaningful and thought-provoking content. Now, with deep respect, CityMatCH acknowledges the original peoples of the land we inhabit here in Omaha, Nebraska, the Umonhon and Sioux. The theme of the conference is examining the roots. In doing so, we acknowledge the native peoples who were forcibly removed from their land. We must ensure their voices and experiences of native people are part of the present and the future. We also know land acknowledgement is not enough. As we will talk about throughout this conference, what are the actions after the declarations? You can find more resources in the agenda. I now have the honor of sharing a recorded greeting and prayer from an Omaha elder, Oceti Sakowin. Ms. Keene has been involved in trying to preserve the Omaha language and culture. I want to note that you may want to turn your volume up as the video starts. She's very soft-spoken, and we have the volume as high as we can on this end, so you may need to adjust it on your end to be able to hear her. All right, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Oceti Sakowin. I'm a member of the Omaha tribe of Nebraska. The correct pronunciation of Omaha is Umonhon, meaning going against the current. And I think that's been our fate all this time. We were put on this reservation here in northeastern Nebraska. About 1854, we signed a treaty with the government. And at that time we were made to give half of our reservation to another tribe, the Winnebagoes. So it's truly been an uphill battle for us against the current. What I'm going to do is offer a prayer. The Omahas like to, before any activity, they like to pray, ask Wakanda to guide them, and to be thankful for what we have. So I'll offer that prayer now, and if you would bow your heads with me. Daria Wakana Tinaha Jesus. Hube Amustala Genikeshe. Ambadega Wada Ete. Well Kishna. Dwam CityMatCH ADT Modigda Gahete Ulu Inashi. Uwika Tanix. Indado Gonite. The Ishbaha. The Tite Uda is complete. Okay. Amen. That's it.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 CityMatCH Leadership and MCH Epidemiology Conference. I'm Jessica Ahule, Director of Programs here at CityMatCH. Thank you to Denise for that very warm welcome to start our day. And I would like to express deep gratitude to Elder Oceti Sakowin for blessing our event with an opening prayer. We're excited to bring you an amazing virtual experience filled with content that will challenge, change, and catapult you towards commitment and transformation to serve our communities. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Michael Warren. He's the Associate Administrator for the Maternal and Child Health Bureau. In alignment with MCHB's mission to improve the health of America's mothers, children, and families, Dr. Warren has also served as the Deputy Commissioner for Population Health at the Tennessee Department of Health and a past president for the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs. Following Dr. Warren, you will hear from Dr. Michael Kogan, and you will also hear from Dr. Wanda Barfield. Dr. Warren, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Good morning. Happy to be joining you all this morning from the Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I want to start out by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Piscataway. I want to thank our colleagues at CityMatCH for hosting this conference and focusing on upstream approaches to data, program, and policies in maternal and child health. I want to also start out by thanking all of you for your tireless efforts over the past 22 months. You've worked to keep communities, states, and our nation safe and healthy by supporting testing and contact tracing and promoting vaccination. You've analyzed data in record time to describe the impact of COVID-19, and in particular, you've helped to illuminate equities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. You've provided technical assistance to community partners as they address not only the clinical aspects of this pandemic, but also the very real social needs of mothers, children, and families in this country. And you've done all this while keeping vital public health programs going, all at the same time. The theme of your conference aligns wonderfully with work that we're doing at the Maternal and Child Health Bureau. Last April, we released our new strategic plan, which focuses on 4 key goals: access, equity, capacity and workforce, and impact. Improving the health and well-being of MCH populations necessarily requires that we look at upstream drivers, including social and structural determinants of health that are influencing health outcomes. CityMatCH has recently partnered with MCHB and the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs to do a deep dive in Region 5, which has historically had the highest rates of Black infant mortality and the highest absolute difference between Black and white infant mortality rates. We've worked together to support Region 5 states in learning about the root causes of disparities, including racism and discrimination, and we recently hosted a 2-day summit to help define the state's efforts toward achieving equity. As you all know well, the longstanding work of improving infant health is inextricably linked with improving the health of women across the life course. MCHB is also pleased to be working closely with colleagues across the administration to strengthen access to care, improve the quality of care, and support state and local innovations in addressing the drivers of maternal morbidity and mortality. The President's FY22 budget includes proposals for a $29 million increase to state MCH block grants, a $30 million increase for state maternal health innovation grants, increases for the Alliance for Innovation on Maternal Health, or AIM program, $25 million in new funding for a pregnancy medical home demonstration program, and $5 million in new grants to train providers on implicit bias. These investments underscore the administration's commitment not only to maternal health, but also to advancing equity through federal programs. I hope you all saw yesterday's White House Maternal Health Day of Action, led by Vice President Harris. The day highlighted the historic $3 billion investment in maternal health in the Build Back Better Act and announced efforts by HHS components to improve maternal health outcomes. MCHB continues to collaborate closely with our HHS colleagues and partners from the White House to advance this important work. We here at MCHB are grateful to continue to collaborate with all of you in urban settings across the country to improve the health and well-being of America's mothers, children, and families. And we're particularly grateful for our continued partnership with CityMatCH and for their leadership, particularly around advancing health equity. Now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Director of MCHB's Office of Epidemiology and Research, Dr. Michael Kogan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warren. I'm honored to help welcome you to the 2021 co-hosted CityMatCH MCH Epidemiology Conference, along with my distinguished friends and colleagues. Our partnerships with CityMatCH and CDC continue to be sources of strength for MCH. I'm joining you from Potomac, Maryland, the native land of the Umonhon. Now, I know your first question is whether I would put on a sport coat and tie to give an opening welcome at just any old conference. And the answer is no. I'm actually surprised you'd even ask that. And so I want to begin by acknowledging your invaluable work for maternal and child health during the pandemic. We're living in an era of both great consequence and a time of pain, though punctuated with moments of inspiration. For MCH epidemiologists, you provided critical assessments helping map the pandemic. There have probably been increased demands for data, for analyses, for interpretation, often with little notice, as well as fewer opportunities to provide surveillance on other MCH topics. For the CityMatCH audience, you may have had to deal with staff shortages while doing double duty helping fight the pandemic. But this isn't new. Social justice filters and fibers the lifeblood of CityMatCH. You brought this conference to New Orleans soon after Hurricane Katrina, and physically helping to rebuild the city was part of the meeting. And for everyone in the audience, your work to bring about a more equitable world has also continued. However, you may have encountered unexpected resistance to public health measures and public health workers, or even outright hostility. Nobody would have blamed you if you had joined the Great Resignation, yet you didn't. You persevered, and for that, you are to be treasured. Now, facing the two pandemics of COVID-19 and health inequities, we're all like citizens of a town's fire brigade, contributing to putting out these blazes. In our Office of Epidemiology and Research, we continue to work in both areas. For the National Survey of Children's Health, we never left the field during the pandemic. Therefore, you will continue to have national and state level data on schedule. The 2020 NSCH data was released on October 2021 with data on 43,000 children and is available at childhealthdata.org for quick analyses, as well as full data sets on the MCHB and census websites. We added questions related to the pandemic on the 2021 survey on increased use of telehealth, missed preventive visits, and interruptions in childcare. Moreover, we continue to be leaders in measuring discrimination. We now have questions on whether children experience discrimination because of their race or ethnicity, their sex or gender, or their health conditions or disabilities. And we continue to put out important research from the NSCH, like an upcoming paper led by Dr. Liddy Harris on US child health trends from 2016 to 2020. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected nearly every aspect of children's lives, including increases in mental health conditions and obesity, disruptions in childcare and school arrangements, and changes in how health services are delivered. We realized that we had a unique opportunity with the NSCH. We had data on about 60,000 children collected soon before the pandemic began. From that, we are building what we believe is the largest cohort of US children and will recontact these families. Our focus will be on the longer term or lingering effects of the pandemic on children's mental, emotional, and behavioral health and learning loss. The result of this planning will be the first longitudinal cohort to the NSCH. Simultaneously, we have struggled, like everyone else, to develop a common way to measure health equity with all its nuanced components. We are in the midst of developing multidimensional measurements of health equity that can be used across states and local areas. We can shine a brighter light on this area if we illuminate where the differences are greatest. Also, we are always looking for ways to build the workforce in MCH research. We've had programs at the master's and doctoral levels, and now we're thinking of ways to support early career professionals. None of this would have come about without the brilliant and dedicated staff in our office. Many people have already had their work recognized nationally, and we've been able to add equally talented people in the last couple years. I truly feel blessed to work with this staff every day. Even if they do let out a loud cheer when I cancel our staff meetings. I want to take a moment to mention that Dr. Reem Gandour won an award this year for one of the top employees in the whole government. There were about 5 winners this year, and Reem won in the science and environment category for her work on the NSCH. To give you an idea of the magnitude of this award, 2 of the other winners had invented the COVID-19 vaccine. And Dr. Fauci was one of the winners last year. So when you see Reem in the virtual hallways of this conference, please tip your cap to her. Let me conclude by returning to where I began. The angst, the tiredness, and for some, the scars from this time will dissipate. But the memories of the work you've done tackling the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and injustice will not fade readily. Your dedication has been immense. I am so privileged to say that together, we're building the path to a more just, safe, and prosperous world for American families. Thank you very much. And now, I'd like to introduce my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Wanda Barfield, the Director of Reproductive Health at the CDC.
Thank you, Dr. Kogan. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CityMatCH. I'm Dr. Wanda Barfield, Director of CDC's Division of Reproductive Health. I'm thrilled to be back here with all of you, united in our work to promote equity and improve outcomes for women and children. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and honor the Creek and Cherokee Nations and their people on whose ancestral homelands I'm speaking from today. I'd also like to thank all my colleagues at CityMatCH, including Chad Abresh, Jessica Uhuli, and Denise Pesha for coordinating this meeting today. And also to thank our colleagues at HRSA, including Michael Kogan and Michael Warren, for your ongoing support and collaboration. While I wish that we were meeting in New Orleans, I'm grateful that we have seen even a broader range of expertise and participation by meeting virtually. My thoughts go out to those in New Orleans who are recovering from the impacts of Hurricane Ida, compounded by the ongoing pandemic. If we've learned anything in the past few years, it's that we just can't predict what's going to happen. But when you have a group of incredible people dedicated to protecting some of our most vulnerable populations, like we all do here with all of you, good things can happen. and I'm excited to be here with you at CityMatch and to hear more about the progress that you've made. With our normal being turned upside down, we've learned to live with a certain level of uncertainty. It has been a tumultuous period, but it has underscored the importance of our commitment to addressing the underlying causes of the disparities that so many people face. Over the past year, we've made progress in actively addressing extremely challenging issues in maternal health, but it remains shameful that in the US, Black and Native populations are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women. And the disparities continue to persist over time across education levels and geography. Even worse, that at least 2 out of 3 all pregnancy-related deaths could be prevented. So we must do more. It's time that we bring an end to these disparities. This year at CityMatch, our focus is on examining the roots. And over the past few days, we'll hear from colleagues around the nation about upstream approaches to data, program, and policies related to maternal and child health. And with modern challenges, we need to take a closer look at how our systems are built and think about how to build strong foundations and programs for maternal and child health. These foundations are essential for optimal health across the reproductive lifespan and are also critical for our ability to respond to emerging challenges, from new COVID variants to climate change. And we have a lot to do to improve maternal and child health in this country. We must continue to build the infrastructure so that we can have robust data that identifies the drivers of maternal and infant mortality and associated disparities. We also need to use data to drive action and inform strategies to improve healthcare and health outcomes. Community engagement is also a foundational part of the process to improve maternal and infant health, and is particularly important for understanding the context of health inequities. We must take the time to listen to community and patient voices and ensure that women get respectful and quality care. We also need to view every layer of our efforts through an equity lens so that we can address the social determinants of health that drive outcomes and achieve health equity. We have an incredible lineup of speakers over the next few days that will share their lessons learned in the field and push us to think critically about tangible steps that we can take to make progress in maternal health. And we all have a role to play in ensuring a healthy future. So thank you again for your dedication and for joining us here today. Now I'd like to hand it off to Chad Abrish, the head of CityMatch. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Wanda. And as Wanda said, my name is Chad, and I am thrilled, along with Denise and Jessica here, to welcome you to this year's conference. And Ashley, if we could put my slides up. I just, in my very brief time with you this morning, want to share 3 ways that you could make the most of this year's conference. And so let me just jump right in here for us. So number 1 way to make the most of this year's conference is to make full use of the conference platform. If you haven't already, I would just encourage you to go ahead and log in, set up your conference profile, and interact with other conference attendees. Maybe even find a colleague that you haven't seen in person now for close to 2 years and send them a message with warm greetings. As others have said, we can't be together in person for this conference again now for the 2nd year in a row. But what we can do is strive to be in community with one another over the course of the next couple of days. So use that conference platform to try to accomplish that. Number 2, in addition to the hard work of learning and engaging all of the session content, let me remind you not to forget to make time for fun. And good news, that fun can start as early as this evening with the live, we're going to do it live, Friends of CityMatCH dance party. That's going to be at 6 o'clock Central Time this evening. And we do want to see your dance moves. So bring your friends, bring your family, and show up tonight for the live dance party. And then finally, my third suggestion for making the most of this year's conference is to identify tangible actions that we can take in support of our shared belief that racism is our nation's biggest public health crisis. You know, over the course of the last year here in 2021, 4 MCH organizations came together and signed a declaration of anti-racism. Those organizations included CityMatCH, the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs, the National Healthy Start Association, and the National Institute for Children's Health Quality. And since the signing of that document, we have continued to work very closely together to identify strategic actions with milestones, because a declaration alone simply will not do. Now, our strategic actions start with internal organizational audits, because we believe that we need to be culpable, and we believe that we need to identify ways that we can change. And from there, our strategic actions branch out to actively invite and to engage the participation of others. Now, to be clear, this work will require humility. We must identify as a field how we have allowed oppression to perpetuate and how we have allowed inequities to fester. And it will require commitment. The documents that we sign in one year should define our actions in subsequent years. Now, I also want to recognize that many of your public health agencies have signed similar declarations just recently. And I worry that too many of our agencies have signed declarations without consistent and meaningful action to back those up. So let's come together over the course of the next few days and identify ways that we can encourage, that we can support, that we can cajole, if necessary, our organizations to take meaningful actions to back up those declarations. So with those 3 suggestions in hand, I would like to now hand it off to Stephanie Graves, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Stephanie is the incoming chair of the CityMatCH Board of Directors, and she serves as the MCH coordinator for the city of Minneapolis. So Stephanie, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. Bapanakwe, Indigenous. And my given name is Stephanie Graves, and I am from Red Lake, Minnesota, and I live and work in Minneapolis. So welcome, and to the West Coast folks, I know it's very early for you, as Denise said. I just want to say how happy I am that we're here this morning. We're all together, even though it is virtually. I'm looking at the number of participants and very excited to see that we have over 250 folks joining us this morning so far. I'm sure that number will continue to rise as people still pop in. I have the honor of being on my ancestral land, which is the Anishinaabe, as well as Dakota and Lakota, who lived here in the Minnesota area. And this morning, I just also have the honor of introducing our first speaker, which is Abigail Echo-Hawk. And I just want to say how pleased I am that she has decided to join us. So first of all, thank you. I just want to say it's a great morning, even though it's only 1 degree here in Minneapolis. And I'm sure for others, you're saying, yeah, that's pretty cold. But for those that live in the Midwest area, it's no surprise, I'm sure. So Abigail Echo-Hawk is an enrolled citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. She is currently the executive vice president at Seattle Indian Health Board and the director of Urban Indian Health Institute. Currently, Abigail is part of multiple committees, boards, and work groups, including the Best Starts for Kids Board, the March of Dimes Health Equity Work Group, the Tribal Collaboration Working Group with the NIH, All of Us Research Program, the Advisory Committee for Health Equity Research at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the NIDA, American Indian and Alaska Native Collaborative Research Engagement Work Group, and the Board of Data for Indigenous Justice. She is an expert in American Indian and Alaska Native health, including strengths and resiliencies, as well as deficits and disparities. So please welcome Abigail. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint here. It is an honor and a privilege to be with you all here today, to share this place and this space with you, whether even though we are in this virtual space, I know we would all love to be seeing and sitting down with each other and sharing stories and introductions. But we can do that in this virtual space, as we have all learned in the midst of this pandemic. And as I listened to the incredible introductions from those who are working to fight for the lives of our children, for our babies and our people who birth and are working in the federal government, to those like Stephanie who are working on her own people's land, fighting for the lives of our people, I am honored to be in this place and space with you. So before I start my presentation, I do want to let folks know, particularly for people of color who are participating and listening to this presentation, I will be speaking about the impacts and the ongoing detrimental harm of white supremacy that is impacted, and I'll be talking specifically about physical violence, sexual violence, emotional violence, cultural violence. And as I do know, these can be very triggering topics. If you need to step away, please do take care of yourself. For those of you who have never heard about the genocides that I'm going to be speaking about, who have never heard or thought about how the impact of federal Indian policies are killing our babies and our people who birth right now, what I want from you is for you to sit in that uncomfortableness. So this isn't a trigger warning for you. This is a trigger warning for those people of color who have been living this every day, along with that of their ancestors for the past 500 years on this land. And for those of you who may be hearing it from a first time, and for those of you whose ancestors may have been part of perpetuating this violence, in order for us to heal, we're going to have to sit through the uncomfortableness that I'm going to be speaking about today, because today we're going to be talking about the strength of a nation, the strength of nations, American Indian and Alaska Native nations specifically. And we're going to be talking about the impacts of white supremacy, white patriarchy, and institutional and structural racism, and how it's been embedded in epidemiology practice, dissemination, and what that impact looks like in American Indian and Alaska Native communities. Because in order to make the changes that were talked about, we have to do more than sign a declaration. Any of us can sign our name on a piece of paper, but what does action look like? So I will be sharing with you not only some of the background so you can gather an understanding, but what is the path forward, not only for you as individuals, but for you as organizations, nonprofits, federally qualified health centers like the one I work at, also those of you working in government bureaucracies. Until we make those systematic change and begin to break down these systems of inequity and injustice, we'll just keep talking. We'll just keep signing papers. And I don't have time for that. My people are literally dying, and I refuse to let that happen in silence. So we are going to be talking about the strength of a nation, the strength of nations, as you learn from what my organization has done in decolonizing data for Indigenous people by Indigenous people. So again, I thank Stephanie for that introduction. People always read off the number of committees that I'm on. I always think I am way overstretched. I belong to too many boards and commissions, and yet I know I have to be on them. I always work to move my mentees into those positions after a while, because it should never be one voice. It's never one kind of representation. It needs to be all. However, when I think about that introduction and I think about what would I tell my community if I stepped into a tribal community on my home reservation in Pawnee, Oklahoma, or my urban Indian community here in Seattle, Washington, they don't care what school I went to. They don't care what committees I sit on for the National Institutes of Health. They don't care the work I'm doing with the CDC. They want to know who I am. And so the work of my organization is grounded in our traditional value systems. So I am Abigail Echo-Hawk. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma on my father's side. But I was born and raised in what you see right now in the heart of Alaska, amongst the Upper Athabascan people, where my mom was adopted by the matriarch of that village, my grandma Katie John, who I'll show you in multiple pictures today. And I know when I go home, the first thing I do is I take off my shoes and I step in that water. And when I step soul to soil with the water rushing around my feet, the salmon swimming so thick, I can reach down and lift one up during the salmon runs. And I look to the mountains and I feel the breeze in my hair. I know my responsibility not only to the land, but because I know my responsibility to the land, I know my responsibility to the people. I am on the lands of the Coast Salish people of Seattle, Washington, the Duwamish people, the Suquamish people, the Muckleshoot people, and I live as an invited guest here on their lands. Most of you probably do not live as an invited guest on the lands in which you are on. And I know land acknowledgements have become all the craze, all of the vogue thing to do, but land acknowledgements from a Native perspective meant accountability and responsibility. They weren't just something that your organization created on a piece of paper and everybody said at the beginning of a conference. When you uttered the words, "I am on your land," you then had responsibility to it. So everybody who just said their introductions and acknowledged the land, I want you to think about what has been your accountability to that land and to the people in which homelands you currently occupy. For me, the responsibility that the tribes hold me in, along with that of the urban Indian community of Seattle, Washington, I am blessed to have been placed by my community as the executive vice president of a federally qualified health center serving American Indians and Alaska Natives, and as the director of the only national tribal epidemiology center in the country. There are 12 tribal epidemiology centers. I'll tell you a little bit about them, but ours is the only one that focuses on the urban Indian community. So I'm a Native person who grew up in a very rural tribal community in Alaska, in and out of my tribal community in Pawnee, Oklahoma. However, I moved to Seattle, Washington when I was 18 years old. Many other Native people also live in large cities across the United States. And in fact, approximately 70% of all American Indians and Alaska Natives currently live in large urban settings across the United States. The Urban Indian Health Institute, which is the Tribal Epidemiology Center, the Research Division, the Epidemiology and Public Health Division of the Seattle Indian Health Board, is one of 12 tribal epidemiology centers across the United States. With that, we hold Tribal Public Health Authority. So that Tribal Public Health Authority is supposedly for access to data related to American Indians, Alaska Natives that have been gathered under the auspice of HHS that we can then use, analyze, and get to tribal leadership so they can advocate for our people for resources and also understand the epidemiology of disease and the impacts of health disparities and health resiliencies within our communities. However, we rarely actually receive the data in which we're searching for, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The Urban Indian Health Institute is grounded in our traditional value systems of understanding the resiliencies and the strengths of our community. We ensure that we are working with a network of more than 80 different organizations across the United States, some funded by the Indian Health Service, others that have established themselves to serve their urban Indian communities, to support them in their public health efforts. And we are working to ensure that they have the data that they need in order to understand how to move forward. And one of our biggest responsibilities is public health response, which we have been embedded in since COVID-19 emerged in early 2020. So to get this going here, I'm sure everybody's seen this, very popular. I'm sure everybody has seen every other interpretation of this, where they take away the fence, where they make everybody the same height, where they put people on bicycles. I was really intrigued by this when it came out some years ago, and I began to see it attached at the bottom of a bunch of people's emails. That was also a thing people were doing for a while. And we all, when we talk about equity, we understand, at least I hope we have a base understanding of when we talk about equality of giving everybody the same thing, we have to recognize that here in this United States, we are on land that has a bloody genocidal history. It is one of oppression. It is one of suppression. It is one of colonialism. It is one of a genocidal history. And for people like American Indians, Alaska Natives, and other people of color who have been impacted by this white supremacy, equality, when you just give everybody the same thing, when you've been harming people for this long and you give everybody the same thing, you're not going to be ensuring the health and well-being of everybody is raised to a point where we are all experiencing good health outcomes within our communities. So this graphic was one of the ones that said, okay, some of these people are smaller, you know, our communities have been impacted and don't have the same resources, so they just need to have a little bit more. And while I agree with the distribution of resources, and I'll also say around land acknowledgements, one of the things Native people are looking for is land back. We want our land back. And that looks differently in each community, but it literally also means land back. That would be a way to reach equity within the Indigenous communities, is the giving of our land back. It also understands that some folks, as a result of these ongoing colonial oppression and white supremacy embedded in institutional and structural racism practices that are embedded in every system in which we interact with, that some folks might need a little bit more. So in this graph, you know, we always see the more boxes so the little guy can see over the fence. However, there's a lot of issues with this, as I'm sure everybody is already thinking about, and everybody's seen the other graphics. One, why are we always pictured as smaller, as people of color, as marginalized communities? Why are we all looking at the same game? For American Indians and Alaska Natives, the health of our people is going to vary differently from the health of an African American community. It's going to be different than non-Hispanic white communities. The health of a Pawnee woman is different than the health of a Lakota woman, both tribal communities, because of the differences in our cultures and ways of knowing and of understanding. Our understanding of what health is different. But yet we try to fit everybody into these neat, tidy boxes. And if we look at the boxes, evidence-based practices, which I have seen for decades, show up in my community, meant to address the high rates of maternal and infant health, the high rates of the deaths within our communities, of the low birth weight, of the high-risk pregnancies. All of these evidence-based practices show up in our communities, but they never had any of our evidence. And yet, when our tribal communities, urban and rural, are funded, they are given this choice of evidence-based practices that they're told to adapt. Why do we have to adapt to you? Why do we have to adapt to research evidence that was never meant for and will never serve our communities in a way that builds forward the prosperity and the strength of our communities? Why do we, and I'm including myself in this, as public health practitioners, continue to try to force interventions and prevention measures that were never meant for that community on them? And what do we tell them to do? We tell them to adapt to us, instead of us thinking, how do we begin the healing that is necessary and needed to address the harm that has come to those communities? Instead of putting the burden on them, how do we put it back on us? So I've re-envisioned this and what this could look like from a Native perspective. So as you might see, if I had more money, I make this like fence blow up in my graphic, but I made my poor brother-in-law do this for free. So he made a little hole in the fence, because for American Indians, Alaska Natives, the idea of health equity and how it has been framed for many years hasn't been one that's worked for us. And in fact, if these health equity efforts have worked, that we've seen over the last 30 years, we would have seen some change in the health outcomes for American Indian, Alaska Native people generally, and in particular for those people who birth and our babies. But in fact, what we've seen is the gaps widening. We're seeing in some states the higher rates of maternal and infant death, even higher rates of low birth weight, rather than seeing any good changes within these disparities. We are seeing even more harm coming to our communities. Western ideas of equity never included us. Western ideas of health equity never included us. And in fact, white supremacy and institutional and structural racism have become and always were embedded in Western ideas of equity that in fact have continued to harm communities versus doing good. I am currently the co-chair of Racism as a Public Health Crisis here in King County, Washington, along with the King County Executive and my dear friend, Dr. Ben Danielson. How many counties declared racism a public health crisis, like ours did? But what does that mean in actual action? Here in King County, we've been given, in quotation marks, $25 million, something that Ben and I, along with our community members who are assisting in this, we call it's budget dust. It's nothing. It's meaningless, truthfully, in the scheme of things. Is $25 million going to address racism in one of the largest counties in the country? No, it's not. We have to start at a more systematic level, at a policy level, at a understanding of, we got to quit just signing declarations. We have to put not only our money where our signatures are, but we also have to put our efforts as public health professionals, as epidemiologists, to make systematic change. This woman in this graphic, she's who every woman in the stories of my ancestors have always been. Her feet are on the ground in the same way I talked about standing in that river. They are connected to the earth and her responsibility to care for the environment around her as it cares for her. Her eyes are on the mountains, her feet are in the water, and on her back is her baby. And on her baby is carried in what is called a cradle board. A cradle board is a traditional type of safe sleep. And in fact, it meets all of the criteria of the Academy of Pediatrics to think about how you keep a baby safe and secure to prevent sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, which is at incredible high rates in my community. Yet this practice, this cultural practice, was one of those that was targeted and taken away and outlawed and banned by the United States federal government when they began to interfere, when they began to move, when they began to kill, when they began to harm our people. They began to take away our cultural practices, including those that preserve the lives of our children, that has resulted in the ongoing high rates of infant mortality we see today. I'm a cradle board maker. I make these for our community. I teach classes along with other community members. As we began to think about how do we restore our cultural practices, those that were already in place, that held our babies and people who birthed secure, safe, and whole before the impact of colonialism. And yet it's a fight we continue to have. When I look at money that flows in from whether it be the states or the federal government to tribal and urban Indian communities, us saying, well, we want to do cradle board classes because this is sudden infant death, SIDS prevention. I help communities fight for the ability to do that. We're continuing to fight to restore our cultural practices. And in fact, these are cultural practices that other communities could learn from. In this picture, this woman is no longer set within this idea of what Western equity could be, and is set and grounded in her indigenous cultures, communities, understandings, and knowledge systems. And yet her baby on her back is looking at what that game looks like, because there are absolute strengths in Western science. It's not what we are grounded in as indigenous people, and it can't be. I can't decolonize a system that was meant to kill me. I can only restore and be part of and grounded in indigenous cultural systems. But we, as Native people, have always gathered the best around us. So in Western science, there are strengths, but it can't be what leads. It can only be what supplements the strength of a nation. My dear friend, Dr. Don Warren, an Oglala Lakota physician, he's always telling folks, in order to reach equity, we have to walk through truth. And we're walking through that truth right now. The land that you stand on is soaked with the blood of my ancestors. It was the wealth in which many of these cities and communities was built off the enslavement of other peoples. We know that as a result of these systems of colonialism and of harm, they have continued to build forward systems that are causing our children to die. Yesterday, my assistant printed off a list of budgets. I'm sure many of you guys are looking at budgets right now. It's grant reporting time. It's end of fiscal years. And I was going through a list of where I had spent some foundation money that had been gifted to my organization. And as I was going down the list to make sure that all of the things were correct, I stopped at one, because on it, it just said funeral expenses. And that's because we had a beloved child, a young baby, just several months old, who walked on to that next place from sudden infant death syndrome. And as a result of the ongoing oppression and suppression of Indigenous peoples, her family was embedded in systematic and ongoing poverty, not of their own fault, but of the systems of inequity that have been meant to marginalize, to push to the side, to eliminate American Indian, Alaska Native people, and other people of color. And her dad just wanted to stay home for several weeks to be able to mourn with his family. And so Seattle Indian Health Board, through the foundation monies that I had, we paid for the funeral. That's the kind of work community does. That's the kind of equity work that we do. We want a family to be able to grieve, to walk through ceremony, to be able to understand that we have to move forward by going through our cultural ways. And in order to move forward, we have to acknowledge this death. And yet when I paid those funeral expenses, and I remember signing that approval, I remember thinking, I wonder if this baby is even in the data. Because we know that there is a gross underreporting of race and ethnicity of American Indians and Alaska Natives, some of the highest in the country, of racial misclassification of American Indians and Alaska Natives in data, particularly within vital statistics. And there's lots of reasons for that I'm going to talk about. Because in order to reach equity, we have to walk through truth. And in order to walk through truth, you're going to have to understand some of the impacts on maternal and child health that have been perpetuated and continued by the United States government. Starting with, I don't know if you know this, but Pocahontas, yes, the one from the Disney movie that is incredibly wrong and inaccurate and harmful. She was one of the very first documented cases we have of a young kidnapped, trafficked. She was kidnapped at the age of 6, a Pamunkey tribal member from a tribe in Virginia. She was kidnapped at the age of 6. She was trafficked. She was sexually assaulted. She was raped. And then she died in Europe away from her family and away from her tribe at the age of 20. Her, along with many other Native women, with the rush of white settlers across our land who were attempting to take from our resources and to eliminate our tribal nations, what they started with, and one of the ways that their war was perpetuated, was violence against our women and our people who birth. They raped them, they kidnapped them, they trafficked them, they impregnated them intentionally over and over and over again. And they did it with absolutely no consequences. So folks tell me, Abigail, that was 500 years ago. And then I tell them about the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in which we are in right now. I've published co-authored a number of reports, including the very first and the only national report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country, where we discovered that not only were our women going missing and murdered like our communities had been saying, but nobody was listening, nobody was paying attention. And in fact, they were so invisible that their families were never seeing justice. Their daughters, their people were never found. Their mothers were never found. Their babies were never found, or those that murdered them weren't. And we have a set of unequal unjust laws that allow, in particular, non-Indian people to come onto tribal lands and perpetuate harm where our tribal communities have very little recourse in prosecution. So for example, I was working with in a particular state where there was a man who had gone from multiple different tribal reservations where he was becoming involved in domestic violence relationships and violently harming sexually and physically these women. And he couldn't be prosecuted, and they would kind of push him out eventually. And about a year and a half into being able to track him through these, he reached another tribal reservation where he then killed his victim and left behind young children. This violence, physical and sexual violence, American Indians and Alaska Natives, women, and LGBTQ plus folks have some of the highest rates of physical and sexual violence that absolutely is impacting their ability to birth healthy, whole, beautiful babies. This violence against their bodies started 500 years ago, became embedded in policy that I can see that allows non-Indians to come onto our land, harm our people, and just do it. And in fact, I did a study here in Seattle, Washington, where we talked to Native women who and identified that out of the more than a little less than 150 Native women we talked to in the city of Seattle, 94% of them had been sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and the average age of first assault was 13 years old. Of those women who reported their abusers, their rapists, only 8% of them saw their rapists actually receive a conviction within the unjust system that is the justice system right now. We are never believed because of rape culture within this community. And we saw, and we could correlate as a result of their sexual assaults, which many of them had more than one, we could correlate substance misuse, homelessness. We could correlate suicidality as they treated the trauma of this ongoing colonialism and white supremacy embedded in this nation. They treated their trauma. And as a result of that, the bodies in which should hold healthy babies, should bring forth life to our nations. We're experiencing so much trauma that many of them, like many women and many people who birth that I know, don't receive and don't have the healthy whole bodies that we used to as a result of this kind of colonial harm. And I wish this was just one example I was going to give you. And I'm really only going to give you 3, even though I could give you thousands. As we move forward, we saw the removal of children in the Indian boarding school systems. So these children were removed for absolutely no reason other than they were Native. And the United States had a motto at the time, kill the Indian, save the man. It was brought forward by General Pratt, who started the very first boarding school. And the boarding schools were based off of a prison system that he had created of military prisoners. And his goal was, with the first boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, was to take away all culture, to train our people to be domestic servants and to be farmers. And if we could take away all of the culture and embed and assimilate Native people, then they would eliminate what was being called the Indian problem. So what they did was go to reservations, and they would go to tribal lands, and they took away the children as young as 4 years old, even younger. And they took them away, and their parents sometimes never saw them again, or they returned and they had been physically, emotionally, spiritually, and sexually abused. Some of them came home and couldn't even speak the same language as their parents. That incredible harm not only harmed whether the mothers and the people who had birthed them, their children being taken from them, it embedded fear within our communities about what these government processes were. And in fact, as a child, I used to play a game with my siblings, and it was called Hide from the Social Worker. Not because my parents weren't great parents, and in fact, they were the best, but because the social workers would show up and interview all of the Native families, and they would take the children. And because of that colonial history of those Indian boarding schools, which the last one did not shut down until 1993, because of that, there was embedded absolutely real fear. And I'm not that old, and I played a game called Hide from the Social Worker as a direct result of that. Imagine the fear that puts in you when you become pregnant and you think about birthing a child that can be taken from you for no other reason than you are a Native person. And that fear still lives today because that system in which children are being taken is just now called the foster care system. These inequities and injustices, they continue not only 500 years ago, but they are current and present right now. And in fact, in this nation, there is a reckoning going on around the Indian boarding schools because of the discoveries of a mass grave in the First Nations community in British Columbia, where they found a mass grave of more than 212 children. Those same graves are all around in graveyards around Indian boarding schools across the United States. Schools shouldn't have graveyards, but all the Native ones did. Something for you to reflect and to think about. This last story that I'm going to tell you is based on a research study that I was doing. I was doing work across tribal communities, doing several different research studies. I was traveling across the nation, and I was sitting down with elders around two kinds of projects. It was probably one of the best times of my life, sitting down for 2 years with tribal elders. And I was doing two projects. We spent the morning talking about parenting and the best ways to parent our children and bring back cultural value systems. And then in the afternoon for the second project, we were talking about statistical smoothing and ways to aggregate small populations data in a culturally appropriate way. Two totally different projects. And I thought, how is this going to work? And then our tribal elders were so smart. It was probably one of the most successful research projects I've ever been a part of, even though they were completely different, and I was unsure how it was going to work. So we had these incredible groups of tribal elders, and I was on one reservation, one of the most beautiful places to visit. And we, of course, fed everybody a beautiful lunch in between the two different projects. And one of the elders was sitting there with me, and she was sitting right next to me, and everybody else had kind of filtered away to go outside, check their phones. And she was sitting next to me, and I remember she reached over and she touched my hand, and she held my hand in hers, and her hand was so soft and so warm. And she said, "Abigail, I want to tell you something." She said, when I was a young girl, I was one of those ones who was taken away to a boarding school, and she was taken away to a boarding school in California. And she said, in that boarding school, I wasn't allowed to talk my language. I wasn't allowed to contact my parents. She said, but I survived it. I was there for years and I survived it. And when I came home, it was hard to come home because I didn't know how to be her tribe, their tribal culture and traditions, because they had taken it from me. But she soon integrated back into her community and married somebody from within her community. And she said in her early 20s, she tried so hard to get pregnant and could not figure out why she couldn't get pregnant. And so eventually she ends up at the doctor's, where she discovers that she had been forcibly sterilized as part of a program that the United States government and the Indian Health Service had perpetuated against Indigenous women and girls, where they forcibly sterilized them as a part of these ongoing genocidal policies in the Indian boarding schools and in other kinds of appointments. And she said, I didn't even know that they had sterilized me. She said, I always wanted to be a mother. And at this point, she's looking at me, and her face was so beautiful with her gray hair and just these lines on her face that told more stories. And her voice was saying, as those tears rolled down her face, and she said, but I was the best auntie. I took care of all of the children, everybody else's children, because I could not have my own. But she said, but I wanted to. She said, I can understand why our young people feel a loss of hope, why we have such high rates of suicide amongst our young people. She said, I almost lost my hope, but I was a good auntie. And she said, I'm being a good auntie here by sharing this information for these two research studies. She gave me a hug, and it was like with her head, she's so much smaller than me, resting on my shoulder. And I cried with her, because the history in which she was telling me is also the history of my family. And in fact, a Government Office of Accountability report found that the Indian Health Service sterilized forcibly, with no consent, large numbers of American Indian and Alaska Native women. And yet this history is one that we don't write about and we don't see. And in fact, my team, we were working to publish a paper on chronic health conditions in American Indians and Alaska Native communities. We were working with some partners, and we went to go through, actually it was through a CDC clearance process to publish this paper because we had CDC co-authors. And it went through that clearance process, and I'm going to use this example, and I have many more, but this is a specific example. When it came back, and one of the things we had cited about the health and well-being and the impact of colonialism and the harm that had been caused to American Indian, Alaska Native communities, we had put in there the Government Office Accountability Report. We had cited it in the sterilization of American Indians, Alaska Native communities. And we had to publish this paper. I'm sure many of you have been for those of you who publish, you got to publish things at a certain speed and pace, particularly for your projects. And what we got back was, we want you to take this section out. It's not going to be approved for our clearance process because it's inflammatory. Because it was inflammatory. What we find, and as myself who does a lot of scientific publishing in both epidemiology and other kinds of public health, looking at the health of American Indians, Alaska Natives, is that's not the first time I've had that kind of thing said. And in fact, reviewers very often attempt for us to take out the mentions of racism, the impacts of institutional and structural racism and colonialism, because they don't let it be published within the peer-reviewed literature. That is a system of institutional and structural racism. Is it inflammatory or is it the truth? There was a review done of the 4 top journals in the world recently. This just came out earlier this year, I believe it was in February. And what they found was 90%, it was less than 1% of all of the papers, peer-reviewed published papers in the top 3 medical journals in the country actually talked about racism. And out of that 1%, 90% of them were opinion pieces versus empirical research. The research isn't even being published. And as somebody who attempts to publish this kind of research, it is very often turned down or pushed to the side or called inflammatory or said, is this necessary? Is this really part of what you're trying to say? When in fact, those are the systems of institutional and structural racism embedded within public health and within medicine that have inhibited our ability to reach and to see justice. Is it inflammatory, or is it the story of the woman whose face was on my shoulder, whose tears wet my shirt, whose hand was in mine, who wanted to be more than an auntie, who deserved to be a mother? Out of that research, we published a paper in the Journal of Epidemiology around statistical smoothing for small populations data, specifically American Indians, Alaska Natives. There is research out there on how to do this correctly, how to look at the fact that we are a small population. Why are we a small population? My tribe was estimated at 38,000 in the early 1800s. By the census of 1910, there was less than 600 of us because of genocide, because of the purposeful killing of our people through disease and also through war. Less than 600. I am the tangible manifestation of my ancestors' resiliency. I am directly descended from number 534 on the US Census, the old man Echo-Hawk. I am his direct descendant. He survived so that I could thrive. So the stories the elders tell us, like the story I just told you from my elder, one of them said in that study, it's hard to bridge the gap between what we know, the elders, and how to show it in numbers. And she was right in the sense of it was hard to show it in the Western idea of what numbers are, of what epidemiology is. When in fact, I was raised in that beautiful area that you saw with lakes and waters and mountains. And in fact, one of the practices that we had in that community was to go out and to count the beaver around that lake that you saw. They would count the beaver in the spring to know how many we could hunt and use for the good and well-being of the people during the winter, and also to ensure population control so that the land was healthy. They did that every year. Every year they counted those. Every year my people counted the number of deaths. They knew the ages by the cycles of the moon. They knew the ages of the deaths. They recorded that history. They had incredible epidemiological practices incredible research practices that were embedded as part of our communities. But what then happened is the data and the numbers were used against us in the involvement of these colonial oppression. But the elders hold the stories within our communities. They hold the answers. And when that woman told me she understands why some of our communities may lose hope, I could understand it then too. Because the data without the stories, without the context, hold no meaning. As an Indigenous person, I'm not a researcher, I'm a storyteller. I'm a storyteller of health and well-being, just like my grandma Katie John that you see right here. She passed down knowledge from generation to generation. And as we began to move forward in doing this, I recognized that those stories and the data were not being passed down. When I said, I wondered if that baby, that one whose funeral I paid for, was she in the data? This is a question that comes up. Some research has shown that in between vital statistics in other kinds of electronic medical records where race and ethnicity are supposed to be captured that we use for our surveillance systems, it's approximately 30 to 40% racial misclassification of American Indians and Alaska Natives. And in fact, with the high rates of infant and maternal mortality, we have had such an impact on our communities. I wish I hadn't seen so many small caskets. I wish I hadn't been to so many funerals, even in the last 2 years, of mothers that I knew, of people who birthed, and yet I have. And I look to my grandma who died at the age of 97, who passed down this generational knowledge and told us it is our responsibility to fight. And so with my grandma's knowledge behind me, the Urban Indian Health Institute embarked on how do we ensure that there is data for Indigenous people by Indigenous people. You can access our website, uihi.org, where you can find a data dashboard where there is the only data in the nation that has been disaggregated for and calculated to show the maternal and child health of urban dwelling American Indians and Alaska Natives across the United States. You can actually see the rates of infant mortality, the rates of, for example, gestational diabetes, all of these things along with strength and resiliencies that are shown within the community. We began this work because nobody else was doing it. They would always say your population is too small. And in fact, the National Congress of American Indians, one of our leading advocacy groups, termed this, or they created this term that said American Indians and Alaska Natives are what we call the asterisk nation. We're always that little asterisk down in the bottom that says statistically not significant. So over the course of a week, I'll see my people called not significant every day. Do we think about the words that we even use within epidemiology? What do they mean? We are a small population because of genocide. My tribal community is now one of a little over 3,000. And someday I'll know we'll be back to that 38,000. But how do we move forward in this idea of strength, resiliencies, and acknowledging the harm? So one of the things that we do is to elevate the stories within our communities. I had began to work with a reporter from NBC who was looking to highlight the high rates of infant and maternal mortality within the community. And so we connected her with 3 mothers from the Seattle Indian Health Board area who agreed to participate in a documentary short film that she was making for NBC and a story that was being worked on. And in the midst of that, I was traveling. We were working on the story for several months. She was following these moms and looking at the impact of institutional structural racism, not only on their care, but on that of their children. And they were all high-risk pregnancies. And I was in Arizona. I was speaking at a conference, and I saw a call from one of my staff, and it said, it's an emergency. And it's about, and there was a name there. I will share the name because her family has allowed for the name to be shared. It was published in the NBC article, and it said it's about Stephanie. And I knew when I saw that either Stephanie had died or her babies had died. When I went up to my room and I called my staff, what I had found out is that both Stephanie and her twins had passed on that day. So the story, which was supposed to be about the impacts of structural racism and how that impacts infant and maternal mortality, ended up being one that was way too real and one that I could have predicted. And I have to say, I wept and I cried as I thought about, did I even cause more stress on Stephanie by including her in this story? But she wanted her story to be told. And so that when that article was published, we were able to honor her. And in fact, it set off a number of community meetings that included the state and the tribal community, where we began to have more conversations on how do we ensure that women like Stephanie and her two babies that were loved, her twins that should have lived, had taken more than just a few breaths. This is the reality of our communities. Even in trying to publicize our stories, we experience the trauma in which we are living in every single day, because women like Stephanie Snook deserve better. And yet they live in systems where they're judged on the color of their skin, the beautiful Indigenous tattoos on their faces, and whether or not people judge them to be appropriate parents. When I look at my grandma, I know that Stephanie and many other people who birthed were not only meant to be good parents, they were meant to birth the strength of our nations moving forward. As we all know, the impact of COVID-19 has had incredible impacts within our community. And for people who birth, we actually saw across some of the urban Indian health programs, in talking to executive directors across the nation, we estimate approximately about 20% drop in prenatal care as folks were really afraid around COVID-19. I co-authored a paper that was published in the CDC's MMWR that found American Indians, Alaska Natives at the time were 3.5 times more likely than non-Hispanic whites to contract COVID-19. And I do want to say, we use the comparison of non-Hispanic whites, not because they're the best group, but like we're not saying they are superior in any way. What we are saying is that they have not had the same impact of all the stories that I've told you. And so their health and well-being isn't impacted by these same issues of institutional structural racism, which is why we use them as a comparison group for our epidemiological analyses. When we did this analysis, we had data from the entire nation, but we could only use 23 states as a result of the underreporting of race and ethnicity. We were only looking for 70% of race and ethnicity to be reported in order to use the data, and only 23 states in the nation actually met that. So what was the impact of COVID-19 and these high rates? I'm sure people saw in the news talks about the Navajo Nation and others and Native people with these incredible high rates of COVID-19, which was happening because of the ongoing poverty and, again, oppression and suppression by the United States government. But then how was the data used? We actually saw a hospital in New Mexico who began to remove newborn babies as soon as they were born from Native women, or who they thought were Native women, because they made the assumption around COVID-19 and that they were all infected with COVID-19. This secretive policy was brought to light. The hospital was shamed, but yet they weren't shamed enough. And I know that that wasn't just one hospital that used that data to harm us. I know that there were others. It was just one that got caught. So data has also continue to be used to harm our communities. And we have to think about that within our epidemiological practice about what harm our data can cause when not used well, because we've seen that harm happen. And in despite of that, why do we know nothing? Why is there such an underreporting of race and ethnicity within this country? When we look about institutional and structural racism, the underreporting of race and ethnicity effectively for American Indians, Alaska Natives benefits the United States government. How does it benefit them? Our treaties are based on tribal membership. So I have a card that someday I'll show some people, and it shows my blood quantum. So me and horses and dogs and other animals have to show how much native blood we have in order to belong to my tribe. This was a colonial practice that was used by the United States government to eliminate Native people. It was part of the genocidal practices, because if you have no tribal members, then you don't have treaty obligations. You don't have to give the resources in which the land you're standing on, those treaties said you had to do as a result of these treaties signed between governments. So eliminating us in the data eliminates, absolutely eliminates the responsibilities of the federal government. And so these colonial practices where if you are Native at all, you have to prove it. And that is part of the colonial harm is embedded in this institutional and structural racism. Including, in addition to that, we find an incredible underreporting of race and ethnicity, like I talked about in the previous study that we did on the 23 states. My organization, using CDC data, put forward a report that I presented to Congress earlier this year on what I called the data genocide of American Indians, Alaska Natives. And I get a lot of pushback on that. It's like, Abigail, that genocide, that's really harsh. It's like, well, that's what it is. You are eliminating us. You are saying we no longer exist. And when we are not in the data, because what happened in COVID-19 is there were several tribes who didn't have and the US government used bad data that didn't show proper tribal membership or the number of communities that were there. And they gave them very little resources through the CARES Act and the American Recovery Act. And as a direct result of that, people died. People died. This genocide is causing the death. And it is also part of the ongoing US way to eliminate us in the data. So when I talk about the underreporting, the non-collection of race and ethnicity, the not calculating small populations data and creating the asterisk nation, as epidemiologists, if you are participating in those kinds of practices without looking at it from this viewpoint and identifying areas to intervene and to bring forward the data that shows the health and well-being of American Indians, Alaska Natives, you are complicit in and participating in the data genocide of American Indians and Alaska Natives. We actually found that some states in the nation, particularly New York, was one that really stood out to me because of one of the largest urban Indian populations in the country. And in fact, New York City was built by Mohawk tribal iron workers, as they're barely reporting any race and ethnicity of American Indians, Alaska Native, and COVID data. Where we look at Minnesota, who is doing the best, and I think about representation matters. Their governor, their lieutenant governor is Peggy Flanagan, a tribal member from that state who fights for representation of American Indians and Alaska Natives because her people matter. We have to think about what are the ways that we, as a community of public health practitioners, as those in medicine, as those in epidemiology and research, how are we complicit? Where are our own implicit biases being part of creating things like racial misclassification? So I trained a whole bunch of hospital systems at one point in time. I would go in and I would train them on how to properly collect race and ethnicity. And I would always have white people who were the most uncomfortable asking about race and ethnicity. And in fact, one of the most common practices that they would have would be to look visually at somebody. And then making that visual interpretation, they would mark them down in electronic medical records of whatever race they identified them with. However, that is the wrong way to do it. And in fact, it allows for continued racial misclassification. American Indians, Alaska Natives, it's not based on the color of your skin. It is based on your connection to your tribe and your community, and everybody should be given the option to do so. And we need to get uncomfortable, and we need to get comfortable with doing that to begin to correct some of these practices that are now not allowing us as epidemiologists and my tribal epidemiology center to have the data I need in order to move forward the health and well-being of our community, because data is so important and so key to that. And if we look at why is this happening, we know that embedded not only in the, I always think about when they were creating, I've been working with a lot of hospital systems who don't even have the checkbox for American Indian, Alaska Native, let alone what to do with the data once they have it. And I always think about what does this programming room look like, where they're creating this data system, and who's sitting in there? We know that within the educational system, it's primarily white men who end up in fields that are computer programming. What if there was a woman there? What if there was a person of color? What difference would that have made? So we have to look at the systematic other parts of institutional and structural racism that have impeded the educational system so that our people aren't even being able to access STEM careers where they could make incredible impact in moving forward the health and well-being of our communities by just being in the room and bringing the knowledge in which they have. We have to address this systematically at so many different levels. But one of the things my team and I do is go through and assist hospital systems in assessing whether or not they actually have the correct data fields in order to capture race and ethnicity correctly, and what are the questions that they need to ask. And some of the work that I've done in law enforcement, particularly around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and then I found this actually in some hospital systems, is that if people aren't actually capturing race and ethnicities, there are data systems that default to white. As an epidemiologist, that's terrifying to me. Race isn't a default. As a Native person, as a person of color, I know race is not a default, but yet there are systems that are defaulting to white because that's the way they've been programmed. We have to make these systematic changes, and we need people to come to us, not because you think we have the most problems, but because we have not just one of the answers, we got all the answers. We have, and one of the ways that you can look at, as if you're an epidemiologist, if you're interested in this, if this is something you want to be part of making systematic change, you can go to my website, uihi.org, where we have published best practices in data collection, data analyses, and data dissemination that are grounded in tribal sovereignty. So that means that Indigenous data sovereignty, which is the right of a tribe and tribal communities to govern all of their data, to be on a nation-to-nation basis with the federal government, with the states, with the counties. All of the information on how to do that correctly is in our guide on best practices on American Indian, Alaska Native data collection. But there are some really simple things that we can all do. In fact, I'm just going to go to them right now because we have to think about what may be possible. I've talked about all these colonial harms. I've talked about how the data isn't truly representing us, that when we're eliminated in the data, that we as epidemiologists, public health practitioners are actually participating and being complicit in the continuing and ongoing genocide of American Indians and Alaska Natives, the elimination of stories of like that woman who laid her head on my shoulder. But there is so much that is possible. Every one of us has been embedded in these institutional structural racist practices that have taught us and conditioned us to judge people, places, and things where we use these institutional structural racist practice to continue to perpetuate the harm that's happened in communities. But it doesn't have to stay that way. We can change what is possible. We have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's the number one thing. I'm uncomfortable all the time. I'm uncomfortable because I'm in places and spaces that I don't expect and don't want me to be there. I always have to come in and establish the fact that I'm just as smart as the other people there. And in fact, I walked into a room one time and the man sitting next to me, it was all epidemiologists, started to explain to me what epidemiology was without even asking who I was. I direct a tribal epidemiology center. I'm an epidemiologist. I know what I'm doing, but he assumed I didn't know. I gave a presentation for the National Institutes of Health, and afterwards, a very high-level individual came up to me and said, "Oh, you did such a good job. You're so articulate." And I said to him, "Did you expect me not to be articulate?" These are the things that we experience and the microaggressions that exist for people like myself in these places and spaces all of the time who don't expect and don't want us to be there. We all have to acknowledge our implicit biases and the structural racism that says, and Abigail Echo-Hawk shouldn't be in this room. And instead, we need to see why folks like myself, there shouldn't be one of us, there should be 10 of us, there should be 20 of us in that room. And it's not about making room at your table. Recognize that the tables that you have been sitting at and building forward this Western idea of health equity have been built in racist and institutional structural racism embedded in. You need to get rid of your table. We need to burn that table down. We need to rebuild it together. And then it would be woven with not only the knowledge that you all bring from your Western perspectives, but also with sage and cedar and sweetgrass and the knowledge of Indigenous peoples braided together that not only bring forward the strength of our nations, our tribal nations, but the strength of everybody within this United States. You have to assess your data collection practices and your data systems. Do you default to white? I guarantee some of you sitting out there have systems that automatically default to white if race and ethnicity has not been collected. Do you have a checkbox even for American Indian, Alaska Native? Do you, when you do your data analyses, continue to put us within that not statistically significant? Do you dedicate the resources? So that's what equity would be to say, okay, we can't include in the big calculations of the data American Indians, Alaska Natives. So we need to dedicate resources to just doing small population data analyses so the community can look and see and understand what is going on within their communities. That's what equity would look like. It doesn't look like the asterisks. You need to ensure that the variables for American Indian, Alaska Natives are there and that you're disaggregating multi-race and ethnicity categories. But we're also asking that you aggregate it. So one of the ways that American Indians, Alaska Natives are eliminated in the data is by only using single race calculations. Single race calculations are based on the idea to be an American Indian, Alaska Native, you can't be anything else. Why? Because if you're something else, then if you're multi-race, they disregard us in the data and don't include us in the calculations, and it continues to shrink our population. Who does that benefit? The United States government, who is looking to eliminate their treaty and trust responsibilities. And people, again, this is embedded in the systems. Very often we'll just get single race calculations. And I'll say, but what if you add in the multi-race? What if you add in my children who are Hispanic and Filipino and are also enrolled members of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma who know their cultural ways and their cultural practices? When I saw the data come out it was actually from the CDC on suicidality, and we had incredibly high rates within our communities, I was like, what does that look like if we included multi-race? Because they'd only calculated single race. When we did multi-race, those numbers actually dropped significantly. And I could see the impact of the efforts our community has been making on combating suicide and suicidality within our communities. So by doing some of these calculations in these ways that truly don't encompass the full community, what you actually do is skew the data that both hides when we do well and also only wants to look at deficits and never at strengths. When it is appropriate and you have been in consultation with tribal communities, collecting tribal affiliation can be very important, but should only be done in consultation and in relationship with the tribal entities within your county, within your state. And there's guides on how to do that on my website, again, in the doing small populations data for American Indians, Alaska Natives. This is one of the biggest ones. When I get folks right out of school, nobody knows how to do small population data analyses. Why aren't we teaching this as what is done within epidemiology courses, within MPH programs, within PhD programs? I have to reteach almost every single epidemiologist that works for me because they've never been taught how to do proper small populations analyses. We have a gap within the educational system around epidemiology, again, embedded in institutional structural racism that only benefits the majority, never those like my community who are a smaller community because of the genocide perpetuated in this country. And always respect tribal sovereignty and Indigenous data sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty means be in relationship with your tribal communities, that they are nations. I am a dual citizen within this United States. I have 2 presidents. And I listen to both. And we have to recognize our own individual responsibility. One of the things that I was always taught, when you hear stories, when you hear the knowledge, this becomes our time, our space, and our place to make systematic change. And not only can we do it, we can do it together. Because the knowledge lies within our communities. And I'm tired of being called a historically marginalized population or a historically underserved population. And I see it all the time, because when I think back on my history, it was of my grandma's photos that I showed you. It's a history of the woman who laid her head on my shoulder, who cried, and who was the best auntie. It is of my children who are both Hispanic and Filipino and American Indian and Alaska Native. That is the history from which I come from. I am not historically underserved. I am institutionally underserved. I am colonially oppressed, but I am historically resilient because I come from the footsteps of ancestors of the people who birthed my father, my father's father, and so on, all the way back, who have continued to hold on to our culture and traditions, who showed me what true epidemiological practice and research and data practices were from an Indigenous perspective, who recognize the harm that colonial systems have brought, and who know that there is a path forward. And it is one where the healing needs to come with all of us together. It's not going to take one of us to make the change. It's going to take all of us. And until we do so, we will continue to see the harm, and I will continue to pay for funerals. And I refuse to let those babies and those mothers die without fighting every single day to ensure that it doesn't continue to happen. And it is together, as we do more than sign a paper, as we do more than say a land acknowledgement, but rather live a land acknowledgement, that we can make systems change for Indigenous people, led by Indigenous people, where we can be allies and accomplices with us. We don't need you to save us. We need you to be part and being supportive of us, because the practices that we have within our communities sustained us for 1,000 years prior, and they'll sustain us for 1,000 years in the future. And our babies are going to be the ones that sing the songs that their mothers could only whisper in silence because they had been outlawed. But my children's children will sing them loud, will sing them strong, and will sing in the next generations of those who will continue to birth the next, and the next generations, looking towards not only 100 years in the future, but 1,000 years in the future, because that is what we as Indigenous people are doing when we look at maternal and child health. We are looking towards the future generations, and it is together that we can do that. But it's going to take bravery. It's going to take you standing up to systems of inequity, recognizing your own complicity within that, and looking towards how we move forward. So today I'll just end with, what are you going to do? What is the change you are going to make? How big is your brave? Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Abigail. That was amazing. I have to say, for some that might be uncomfortable, sit with that uncomfortableness for a while, and maybe it will lead to action for you. And for me, it was very inspiring. And I'm sorry to say, or I'm not sorry to say, let me be real, that it brings me to tears. The emotion, thinking of historically how long we've been on this road and how much further we still have to go. So I think that's where the emotion comes into play, thinking and listening about your ancestors and the elders that you've engaged with, as well as what we have done here in Minnesota, and keep trying to move forward with all the various tribes that we have here as well. So I just want to thank you and for sharing that powerful presentation. And I think they put the links in the chat. Miigwech to you, Abigail. And if there's any questions, I think that they have time for a few questions. Denise, are you going to take over that portion?
Yes, we can. Can they hear me? Yeah. We're going to be able to open up for questions. Thank you, Abigail and Stephanie. We have the Q&A function if you want to put questions there. We also, that would be easier than chat. I'm looking, chat's blowing up. As you can see, Abigail, I think, with all the thank yous and how thought-provoking and moving. I do have one question here. So do you have recommendations for training resources on small population data analysis?
Yeah, so there has been some really great research done and published in the Journal of Epidemiology and others from American Indians, Alaska Natives, doing small So when we think about small populations data analyses, there's really important things to think about, particularly for American Indians and Alaska Natives, on what is the right kind of aggregation and where does disaggregation need to come in. And so if you literally go into PubMed and Google American Indian Alaska Native data, you'll come up with a whole list of American Indian Alaska Native scholars who have published on this, including myself. And in addition to that, there is some really great work that is being done right now by the National Institutes of Health, their tribal advisory group that is working together to put a list of resources on small populations data analyses. Another really great place to do that, again, my website has information, but the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, Policy and Research Center, which is headed up by Dr. Yvette Rubidoux. She used to be the director of the Indian Health Service. Her and her team also have incredible resources on small populations data analyses. And again, very important. It's good to hear people are really interested in getting more resources and understanding how to do good small population data analyses. And we also have to fight so hard to get this embedded within actual educational systems, particularly within epidemiology and biostatistics. I'm often called in and I do a lecture. I do one lecture and I'm sure it's the only one they get for their entire time. And that's so disappointing. We really need to make it a requirement because when we look at the populations in the United States that are considered small, they're small for a reason. And we have to look at that from an equity lens. And if educational systems are truly going to make change, they need to look at where there's embedded systems of racism, particularly within epidemiology and the way it's taught in this context. And we have to fight for making some of these classes mandatory. So I also see on here the recommendations for working with data that already has single race categories. I unfortunately have to do that all the time, and I hate it. I mean, I recently just had to do it with a paper that we're about to publish around the impact of COVID-19, specifically on urban dwelling American Indians, Alaska Natives, where we found very similar rates of COVID-19 and the impact. People often assume because people are in a city that the health disparities are different than what happened on the reservation. Well, sometimes it may vary a little bit because institutional structural racism is embedded across this whole country. We find the similar health outcomes, but the data that we received was all single race data, and the data has been gathered, was already gathered by a government entity, not by us. And so we're often using these secondary data sources where we don't have the control over the single race data. So I always state it as a limitation. There's limitation sections in what we do for a reason. It is a limitation, absolutely. And we are also engaged in national advocacy on what it means for me to decolonize data. Some of that is specific to the cultural practices that we have as Indigenous peoples, but also looking at these issues of systematic racism. So there are efforts going on that are being led by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. That is a really great place to start. I was part of a data commission that put forward a list of recommendations very recently. And there's congressional efforts going on right now looking at the overhaul of surveillance systems across the United States. So when we think about it, we also have to engage in the advocacy. To make systems change, we have to engage in the advocacy as public health practitioners, as folks in medicine and folks in epidemiology and research. We have to. We have to change the systems that only give us single race data. So I always state it as a limitation. We always look to see if there's multi-race data that we can combine. And just so folks know, also American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Pacific Islanders are one of the largest growing groups of multi-race individuals. And again, for us, it's not about, I can be part of multiple cultures. Why wouldn't I be able to be? That is, again, an idea of white supremacy that is embedded that says you can only be one thing. My children are Hispanic and Filipino and American Indian, Alaska Natives, and they step into ceremony the same way that they step into their Filipino community. So we need to recognize people for all of who they are, and we need to make changes at the systems level, which is their federal efforts going on right now that I suggest everybody engage in.
We do have one question in the chat. Are there any resources you recommend that document traditional cultural AI and birthing and childcare practices that would help health professionals familiarize themselves within a culturally appropriate way?
Yeah, there's a really great book called Red Medicine by Patricia Gonzalez. And it's one of the few books, and it's really all about Indigenous birthing practices. I mean, we're really seeing a resurgence of these birthing practices. And I want to give like a shout out to my dear friend, Cami Goldhammer and Kimberly Salas, who as Indigenous women who created and have trained more Indigenous breastfeeding lactation consultants than has ever been done. 2 Native women created the curriculum, worked nationally. They're also doing incredible work around doulas and midwives. And so while they're called doulas and midwives within Western ideas, if you read this book by Patricia Gonzalez and by others, we always had those traditional roles within our communities, and we had doctors. So at my clinic, the Seattle Indian Health Board, we have traditional medicine practitioners who work side by side along with our MDs. And in fact, we credential them and we give them equal say in what happens with our relatives, which is what we call patients, as we call them relatives. And so we've embedded our traditional practices into our medical practice. And we have a number of Native women, a large number of Native women who give birth every year, not only with doulas, midwives, their aunties, their grandmas, an MD, and a traditional health practitioner. So there are incredible systems like ours that Indigenous communities are doing incredible at re-embedding and grounding ourselves in our culture and tradition, because we know that's what works. If I had every Native woman in our clinic walk out with a cradle board, I'd consider that successful. Because if they kept their babies in their cradle boards as they go, and we train them over 3 days and we give them a lot of information, just like the aunties used to do, and they walk out with not only knowing ways to take care of their babies that maybe they haven't heard before, but they walk out with traditional safe seat practices. And even if they don't have another bed, because we always think about co-sleeping as possibility of risk, is that in a cradle board, in a bed, that baby is safe. So really embedding our cultural practices back in and being part of prevention for our babies, and also prevention and strength of our people who birth.
Okay, and another one in the Q&A. I'm working on a non-epidemiological project to evaluate grants to Native American and Native Hawaiian libraries and museums. I'm wondering how to incorporate the concept of data genocide into our work, and wonder if you have any recommendations.
Yeah, so first of all, I hope that you're working with some of the incredible folks who do this kind of work, including there's some leaders in this area for Native Hawaiians. They actually had me come in, and for American Indians, Alaska Natives, they actually had me come and speak at their last conference, specifically around this idea of data genocide, is really thinking about the information that is presented. If you're reviewing grants and evaluating grants, sometimes people look and say, well, you didn't have the data for this. You had like a few stories. And I always tell grant reviewers, the reason we don't have the data is because the systems of inequity that have effectively ensured the data doesn't exist, or the data that is there only tells a story of deficits and never of strengths. So when you're evaluating grants and working with grant reviewers, are you preparing them in a way for them to say, oh, like we would have wanted, and like this other group has all of this data that shows all of these things, and this is why they should get the funds, or this is what they're going to do with it? Is that for communities like ours who don't have the data, there's a reason. And in addition to that, when we think about libraries and museums, we need to hold the real truth and the real culture of what has happened. And so one of the things, this is actually done by Sandy Littletree. There is an article done by Sandy Littletree and Miranda Bernard Lewis, and it talks about very specifically, I believe, I can't remember the title of the paper, but they actually talk about the relationality of data and the relationality of data held within library and museum systems. And so there are incredible scholars out there who are already doing this work and who are publishing incredible work on that, and finding that information and embedding it. I really feel that as an Indigenous scholar who's been doing this for a really long time and trying to publish in peer-reviewed papers, and I see the elevation of scholarly work by non-Indigenous people who are talking about my community, instead of the Indigenous people who are not only sharing about their communities, but live the experience. So embedded again within the academic systems and how we value peer-reviewed literature and what gets published. Also, we see the embedded racism structures in there. And so really looking and doing your research on the authors. If you're only looking at things, I'm just saying for this library project, and if you looked at the authorship and you're only including information about these people looking at other people instead of those who are embedded in the culture, traditions, and understandings of them, you're actually, again, contributing to the overall problem that we see. And I'm not saying non-Indigenous people can't be part of it, but they can't be leading it. That's inappropriate. They need to be supportive of and elevating the voices of the Indigenous people, like in this particular area, Miranda Bernard-Lewis and Sandy Littletree, who are doing this incredible work within this field of libraries and museums.
Thank you, Abigail. I'm looking, I don't see any other questions in the chat or Q&A. Give it a moment. Thank you so much, Abigail. What a powerful way to kick us off, and thought-provoking. I've seen, I think there's a lot of processing going on right now, which is good. And discomfort, which is where we want to be, right? So thank you. Any last words, Abigail?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity. And for Indigenous peoples, when we think about those that are the ones who birth, and I want to be clear too, that when I talk about people who birth, I'm not assigning a gender identity to that. That was not traditional to Indigenous peoples. People of all gender identities birth, and they held an important place because they were the most sacred. And so in our communities, we focus on building forward the strength of our people who birth and ensuring the lives of our babies, because we know that's where the strength of our nations is held. And so we believe that when we restore their health and well-being, the health and well-being of our entire communities will flourish. And letting those beautiful voices, then those young people, step into the areas of leadership so that they can lead us into prosperity is the strength of American Indians and Alaska Native communities. And as you all think about what I've shared with you today, if I left you with nothing, it is that our communities are strong, bold, beautiful, vibrant, and thriving, despite the ongoing suppression and oppression of this country and the embedded institutional structural racism. And that is because we know that not only can we fight it, but we can beat it. It's just going to take a lot of teamwork to do so. So thank you for sharing this space with me. I really enjoyed being here.
Thank you for being with us.